What's going on, YouTube? Thanks for tuning into the channel. It's your boy Devin Coates. I have another book review for you. This is Malcolm Gladwell's Outliers, The Story of Success. I actually took a lot of notes on this, so I'm going to try to upgrade some of my format. But for this one, I'm just going to kind of keep it the same, just so I can put it up for you guys. But just to start off, this is like one of those books that was obviously very well known, highly renowned, and I kind of like was taken aback a little bit by the way that it's written, or more of the content in the book. So just to start off, this brings up the 10,000 hour rule, but in the beginning of the book, and actually throughout, especially in the beginning, but throughout, for me it was actually a bit like discouraging, because one of his basic premises is that our whole idea of, like, you know, working hard and doing everything that's necessary, that whole idea of like being self-made, he kind of the whole book is kind of squashing that like it's about somebody's individual personality that's driving them to success. His big position is that a lot of it has to do with environment. So one of the first ones he goes through is looking at hockey. I think it was in Canada, and yeah, it was the Canadian hockey team, and he was looking at where the cutoff dates, and this could actually was found in tons of other things. So basically, the cutoff date was like so January were all the older kids. If you're born in January, all the older kids, that was the beginning of the cutoff date. He looked at all the records of all the people who ended up making the national team in Canada for hockey, and he noticed that most of them were born in either January, February, or March. And when he thought about it, he looked back and he's like, so why is this? When they looked at it, it's because the cutoff date, you'll be older if you were born in January, February, and March. Now, when you're 20 years old or 18 years old, you know, a few months isn't a huge difference. But when you're younger, so say if you're prepping these kids around 6, 7, 8, you know, if you're a whole year older, that is a big jump because of how much you grow. So generally the older kids were thought to be better, but they had actually just matured more than the others, and then that was compounded over time. So they weren't scouted as much, they weren't seen as much. And I know in high school, I mean, even in America, it's like that's kind of the same thing. Like if you do sports and you're very into sports and your parents are, they will not have you be, if you missed the cutoff date, be like the youngest in your grade. They'll make it so you're the oldest in your grade. And I actually knew a couple athletes that were like that. They made sure that they were older so that they could have more strength. And I wrestled, so that's something where like you have muscle maturity as you get older. Like a 14-year-old, when a 14-year-old wrestles an 18-year-old, there is a big muscle maturity difference, and that's like high school, 14, 18. So a 19-year-old wrestling a 14-year-old, it's a big difference. So that's something I've even observed, and that was the basic premise. So it wasn't that the players were necessarily better or have more innate ability, it was that they were born at a time which gave them an advantage of size. So he goes through a lot of different things that kind of corroborate that, but he also did bring up the 10,000 hour rule. So he talks about the Beatles. So the Beatles, basically, they didn't really have, they weren't as successful starting out as like they definitely ended up, and they basically had to play in like these strip club joints in like Hamburg, and basically they just played for, I think it was like something like 8 hours straight. They would just be playing for 8 hours straight, like every day of the week, or like 290 days of the year. And essentially they got a ridiculous amount of practice to be very good by the time they started getting things shipped overseas and getting some of the breaks that they got. They had already put in so many hours to be so much better than everyone else, or not even everyone else. They just improved themselves to the point where when they performed on stage, they had been doing this for well over 10,000 hours. He goes through Bill Gates, Bill Joy, I think his name is, and those are some people that also created a lot of like the internet and things that had to do with that. But then he also looked at the time period in which they were born. There's different, I'm removed from the Beatles now, Bill Joy and Bill Gates, they were all born at a time when, you know, computers were first getting on the scene to be kind of a consumer item, and most places did not have access to them. They lived in areas and in certain situations where they had access to computers like a decade before everyone else. So that gave them a market advantage to become who they eventually became. Obviously, they had to work to get everything to work out moving forward, but in the beginning, they had the environmental situation or resources around them that allowed them to kind of become who they become. So he goes into a lot, and I'm not going to go through every single example of where their environment kind of helped them. I mean, he goes through geniuses where there's one genius, like he tests very high in the genius category, becomes nothing, and then Oppenheimer, the guy who ends up making the atomic bomb, what was the big differences? A lot of it had to do with just what class they were in, and the way that they questioned authority. Upper class questioned authority more, lower class didn't, and then in the end, as their life progressed, it kind of led to very different results. He goes through many different examples in terms of that. So I mean, that was really what the book was basically about, was that the story of success is not often how it's painted to us through the media, of being like, you know, an individual person is just, they're just wired different and they work really hard. A lot of it had to do with the environment that you're brought up in. And this kind of was just evident through every story in the book. It was like, I know they even did for like why Asians are so good at math, and some simple ones were like even just the language. I know I can count, for example, like in Chinese or Japanese, and even when you look at it, it's a lot easier to comprehend. Like, you know, we have words in English, at least, like, you know, like 47 or 99, 20, like 20, for example. That has nothing to do with 2. In Japanese or Chinese, it's literally the number 2 and 10. And if it's 21, it's 2, 10, 1. It's not like this complicated thing. You don't have to learn new words when you reach 10. It's like, you literally just say like, whatever it is, 2, 10, and then that equals 20, and it's a lot easier to understand, which makes it easier for their brain to wrap around holding digits in their head and add and subtract, because the numbers actually kind of are closer together to something you can break down. And also their work ethic, from being rice paddy farmers, you have to be up very early, and it's very meticulous work. You have to do it every single day. So that work ethic has kind of been, it's just a cultural thing, that if everybody's subsisting off rice paddies, you have to work very hard. And also it kind of, and now I'm getting kind of into the weeds of the nitty gritty of what was explained, but their government, they're like the feudal systems that were kind of brought up in England and stuff like that couldn't be done on rice paddy farms. So they actually have more of an entrepreneurial culture back in the day, where their effort was literally connected to their reward. And he talks about that those are the 3 things you need for fulfillment, is an effort to reward ratio, where you can see that your efforts equal reward, it's autonomous, and it's complex. And those are the things that lead to fulfillment in any type of work. And long story short, for the rice paddies that I'm talking about, basically that kind of was all brought. So the hardworking aspect of a lot of like the Asian culture, he's kind of bringing it back. It's a cultural thing, because that's how, that was the environment that was around. You know, the more meticulously you took care of your rice paddy, the earlier it got up, the better you would be off. Now, when you're working in a feudal system, there's not the same feeling. They're just going to kind of rip you off to start with, like for whatever you plant and things like that. And if you think about it, if your crop is really bad, you still kind of get screwed over by whoever like the landlord was. But it was a very different setup for economies that are based on rice, since rice is something so meticulous that if you just rip people off, there's no way you would have the persistence to tend it where you would get a good crop and a good yield. So I mean, that was really what the book was mostly about, was the fact that it's not an individual characteristic that creates success. It has a lot to do with what your environment is. And then he talks a lot about what fulfilling work is. Fulfilling work is work that is, one, autonomous, complex, and there is an effort to reward type of ratio. The more you put in, the more you get out. And kids that grew up in an environment like that are much more likely to be more successful, because they understand that that's how they get fulfillment, which makes them want to work harder. But there's plenty of examples throughout the book. I might do something deeper with all these notes. I mean, I have notes on every single chapter, so there's a lot more, but I'm getting past 10 minutes here, so don't want to spend too long explaining myself. Thanks a lot for tuning into the channel. It's your boy Devin Coates. Like, comment, subscribe, dislike if you didn't like it. Any feedback is great. Till next time, peace.